Welcome to our Sound for Video session. It is the 25th of August, 2016, and we're going to do a question and answer session this week. Apologize for the late arrival here. We had some technical difficulties. It looks like a lot of people are watching Netflix right now or something along those lines. and hopefully we'll be solid now that we're connected. So this week we're going to talk about a few questions that were submitted by a few of our friends here, and let me just jump right into them. The first one was a question by Victor. And Victor, I apologize. I don't know how to pronounce your last name. I think it's Dutch. And I apologize in advance. I'd rather not butcher it. So he had a couple of good questions. First off, I have a question about microphone placement. Whenever you boom a mic, is it best to aim at the chest, or is it still better to aim more directly at the mouth? I got stuck in memory to go for the chest somehow, but is it true? Well, that is a very good question, Victor. And let me kind of share my perspective on that. I think the most important thing to do is that when you're shooting, recording the sound, and you're monitoring the sound, you need to use your ears. Adjust the aim of the microphone a little bit and figure out which of those sound best. Now, my take is that generally it's going to be best to, again, you're booming from up above, aim down at the, I generally aim for the mouth or maybe down here at the chin. And the times when I would change that aim to aim more at the chest is if you are finding that the person's voice and the microphone are resulting, that combination is making a very sibilant recording. You might instead aim at the chest because that may cut off a little bit of the sibilance and pick up a little bit more of the chest resonance instead. But again, number one thing to do is to use your ears, figure out what works best. What I might also recommend is that when before you're actually in a shooting situation, you might do some tests, even on yourself. Get that microphone boomed up above, aim it at your mouth, then aim another one at your chest. See if you can tell a difference and which one you prefer. And that can be sort of your default starting position with that particular microphone. So those are some thoughts. I hope that's helpful for you. Then he had another question. Another question I have regarding dialogue in post is loudness. To me, this is still a rather technical aspect of it, and I'm more of a language social person rather than a technical. Could you talk a bit more about the loudness wars and if they're all over now? That's a good question. I'm not necessarily an authority on that, but here are my thoughts on that. First of all, the loudness wars, I think, refer to the fact that before a few years ago, in most countries, there were no regulations on how any sort of audio material was mastered in terms of loudness or anything of that nature. And almost everyone was aware that when you watched something on TV, whatever the programming was, you would watch that. Then when it was switched to commercials, it suddenly seemed like the commercials were much louder. And indeed, many times they were, because they were trying to get the attention of the viewers. Also, on the music side of things, we saw a lot of loudness wars as well, or we saw the loudness war, which was, you'll notice over I think it started really kind of in I think you saw more of it starting in the 90s. But what they started doing is they changed the way they mastered the music, and they increased the loudness more and more and more, which meant they did more compression and then normalized all the audio up so it seemed much louder. And perceptually, indeed, it was much louder. The problem with that, of course, is that when you do that to an extreme, what starts happening is you compress all of the dynamic range out of the audio. And at some point, it started getting pretty silly, in my opinion. And in fact, in some cases, we saw music, I think in the late 90s and early 2000s, we started hearing music that was, as an effect, they were purposely distorting. And there's always been a little bit of that. Don't get me wrong. Guitars, you run them through amplifiers and purposely distort them and saturate them and things of that nature. But we started to see even more of that. And in fact, one thing that kind of sticks out in my mind is a great example of what I would call overcompressed music. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this band is bad. In fact, I actually like this band. Coldplay, their Milo Xyloto album, if you've ever heard that, the very first two tracks, there's kind of a short intro that's maybe 30 seconds long, and then it goes into the first main song. And if you listen to that, and you can look it up on YouTube here afterwards, you will hear a very clear example of what I would consider overcompression, where you can't make out any of the instruments anymore. All you hear is this massive wall of sound. And I think that's a great example of kind of what happened at the pinnacle of the loudness wars, in my opinion. And we saw the same thing on television, where everyone was sort of competing with each other to make their programming a little bit louder than everyone else. Is it over? Well, we did on for the television side. I don't know entirely for radio, but for television, most countries have now passed legislation where they have regulations on how loud anything can be, and they actually have standards. And that's, in fact, if you take the, or if you look at some of my videos on YouTube, or you take the post processing course, which we launched this week, by the way, if you weren't aware, you can see that over at learnlightandsound.com. We talk about loudness there as well, and some of the targets we use. And you'll remember from those conversations that if you're going to television broadcast, you need to find out what the loudness unit's full-scale target is for the country where your programming will be aired. In the United States, it's minus 24 LUFS. In Europe, it is minus 23 LUFS. Actually, in the United States, it's minus 24 LKFS, which is the same thing as LUFS, just a different name for the same thing, really. And in other countries, they've generally followed one of those two standards as well, where they do have legislation. So are the loudness wars over? There's regulation now to manage some of that. So you should not now, when you're watching TV, although I still seems like sometimes I do hear a difference, but when you go from the actual programming to commercials, you should not now hear a massive difference unless the TV commercial has, or TV programming has purposely decided to go at a lower loudness. But I don't know. I guess the governments are doing some things to regulate that to some extent. I don't know if it's entirely over. On the web, there is no regulation over loudness. So you will notice when you watch videos on YouTube or on Vimeo or wherever, you will notice differences, and some pretty extreme differences. And there are people that know how to master the music so it goes really, really loud, and others that maybe aren't necessarily as aware of that or whatever it may be, but don't necessarily master that loud. But the web content is all over the board still. So in that regard, I suppose that at some level, the loudness wars continue. Next part of his question was, is loudness these days simply a question of setting it all to minus 24 LUFS? And I would say the answer to that is no. If you're going to broadcast television, then of course, yes, you need to follow the broadcast legislation targets for that particular country where you're looking the content. On the web, there are no standards, as I mentioned just a second ago. However, the most common recommendation I've heard for web and any content that will be listened to on mobile devices, the recommendation I hear is minus 16 LUFS. And I actually think that's a pretty good recommendation for web and online, and the reason and mobile. And the reason I say that, and the reason why, from my point of view, it makes sense to be louder on mobile, is that a lot of times people are listening to content on mobile devices in rather poor listening conditions. So they're in cars, they're in trains, they're in airplanes, they are in taxis, whatever it may be, or even in just regular public places or offices. They're using headphones, oftentimes not the best of headphones. And so in a lot of cases, it makes sense to go a little bit louder. Also, a lot of these devices don't have amplification circuitry that can really do things justice. So you really need to master the audio so that it's, I think, at minus 16 LUFS. So I would say, Victor, definitely it's not just a matter of going to minus 24 LUFS and being done with it. It really depends on where you plan for your content to be consumed or listened to. All right, great questions there, Victor. Thanks for those. I also had a question from our friend Mark Latani, and let me just pull that up here. All right. He actually sent this earlier in the week. As many of you probably know, the Canon 5D Mark IV was announced. And actually, he said, in anticipation of the Canon 5D Mark IV announcement on Thursday, I was looking into the aperture monitor you reviewed, and that took me to batteries. Someday, could you please run through the various battery formats and vendors? In particular, A, how does the Anton Bauer system work, and why is it so dear? And then B, the Watson NPF F975 lithium-ion battery pack I think you mentioned somewhere along the way. So let me talk a little bit about batteries. I think that's a fine topic for us in the audio world. And they can, interestingly and fortunately, they can often be used to power both audio devices and to power cameras as well. So, for example, here we have what is often referred to as a Sony NPF or L type batteries. Sony originally introduced these, I believe, for several of their cameras. They're actually fairly ubiquitous. They're used for lots and lots of things. You can see they have the little contacts right there on the end. They come in various capacities, and this is similar to the one, Mark, that you were referring to, the Watson. Uh, which one was it exactly? Again, it's the NPF 975, and it's about this size. It may be a little bit thicker than this one. So that's one type of battery. These are 7.4 volt batteries, and they come in various capacities, which are represented by milliamp hours, mAh. So obviously, the larger the mAh or milliamp hours, the longer they can power your device, depending on what it is. So that's a very common kind of battery. I actually use these to power my sound devices, 633 mixer recorder, and they work beautifully. They also work with a lot of the monitors you put on your camera, the external monitors. Many of them are powered by these, and that's a great way to go. Now, you also mentioned the Anton Bauer system. Here is an Anton Bauer Digital 90, and you can see a couple things about it. It has this is a pretty robust battery and a pretty humongous battery. The contacts are actually back in here, and then these three here make up the mounting system. This is used more in the professional space for big cameras, cinema cameras, and things of that nature. And you typically will need a battery plate to hook it up to your camera. I also use a battery plate to hook it up. Well, actually, no, I don't use a battery plate. I actually use, they have this little output here, and this is called a D-tap or P-tap output. They have a whole variety of cables that then connect to that, and can connect to a whole multitude of devices. Here, for example, we have I believe that's Hyros, or is it Limo? I don't remember. I think it's Hyros. In any case, this one in particular I have for my Zoom F8 and for my sound devices 633. They both happen to take the same input connector. So the difference with the Anton Bauer is actually a 14 watt, I believe. What's the exact spec? 14.4 watt, or sorry, 14.4 volt. And I believe this one says 6,000 milliamps. So this, for example, will power my Zoom F8 for, I think it was 15 to 20 hours. So you can get a sense for the difference. If I were to use one of these to power my sound devices 633, I bet you I would get somewhere in the range of 3 hours, I'm guessing, somewhere around there. So there's a big difference between those. The reason this one is so dear, well, first of all, this is extraordinarily expensive, this battery system, for those that are used to buying batteries more like this. And even these can get very expensive. The Watson, for example, I believe retails for somewhere around, I think it's like between $50 and $75 US. This battery here retails for $270 US last I checked. So there's a big price difference, and this is an entire system. You may have to buy battery plates depending on how you're using it. And get a load of this thing. This is the charger. This is actually a dual charger. It has a big screen. It's Wi-Fi enabled. The interesting thing is that this charger, and it's massive, that charger can actually charge one of these batteries in approximately, I think it's an hour or an hour and a half. So it charges very quickly. There's a lot of monitoring circuitry in here as well. So it has some features built in, for example, and this is a layman's explanation. So if I don't get this entirely right, please excuse me. But the idea is that it actually regulates the voltage very carefully. has some very robust circuitry in there to manage that so that it doesn't affect your camera or the other electronic equipment attached to it. Why is it so dear? Well, there's also a V mount. Sony makes a kind of a competing standard called Sony V mount. Um, Everyone has an opinion on that who's used V mount versus Anton Bauer Gold mount, which is what this is. My perspective on it is that they're both good. The Anton Bauer mount tends to be a little sturdier just in terms of keeping the battery on the plate. Lots of people have complained about with Sony V mount batteries doing silly things like picking up your camera by the battery and the whole thing falling apart. Not a wise thing to do. Don't recommend doing that from the start. But the Anton Bauers tend to be a little bit more robust in terms of how they connect to the plates. So other than that, I think you can get all of the same quality in terms of battery life and all those things in the Sony V mount system. And there are lots of third-party Sony V mount batteries as well. So why is it so dear? I guess it's so dear because it's the reason I have it is because I needed a better powering solution for my Zoom F8 than the inbuilt AA batteries. They didn't power long enough for some of the shoots I was doing, so I didn't want to have to be popping batteries in and out all the time because I am a solo operator, and I just didn't want to have another hassle of having another set of batteries to change out. And in the Zoom F8, it's unscrewing a thumb screw, opening a door, pulling out a thing, changing out 8 batteries, putting it back, so on and so forth. It just takes too much time. And that's why I originally went with the Anton Bauer system. It's a very, like I said, it's an expensive system and not for everybody. So hopefully that's a little bit of context for you and useful for what you're looking for. All right, let me just check in with I just want to check in and see if there are any other questions that I missed over on the actual site. And let's see, we've got some guys. All right, we have lots of visitors there, so things are looking good. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. All right, what I thought I'd do next is actually talk a little bit about EQ, and we have just a few minutes here. In the post-processing course, we talked about EQ a little bit, what it is, how to use it to sort of mellow out the sound of a voice. If you get a recording that sounds kind of harsh, sometimes EQ is really helpful to kind of mellow that all out and bring it, just make it a smoother experience for those listening. And what I'd like to do here is just show you some other things about EQ that we haven't covered in the course yet that I'd like to talk a little bit about. And let me share my screen here. We've got Adobe Audition. And we have some audio here. And let me just pull up the parametric equalizer here in Adobe Audition. So if I go under Effects and then Filter and EQ, we're going to come down to Parametric Equalizer. All right. One thing I haven't covered yet in the course, and I am planning to do another segment on this, is what do you want to do if you want to sweeten a voice? And there are some things you can definitely do. I would actually recommend just starting maybe with this vocal enhancer preset within the parametric equalizer. And you may need to tweak things, but it actually is not a bad place to start. For example, this high shelf here, this is way too extreme in my opinion under most circumstances. But if you do have a very dry sounding vocal or dry sounding dialogue, cranking that up can definitely help to add a little bit of a sparkle or high-end sheen, if you will. You have to be careful too, because if you are struggling with a kind of a sibilant recording, you don't probably want to add a lot of that. Or if you do want to add it, you probably want to add it after the sibilance range, which is somewhere, usually between 5 and 10 kilohertz here. So that's one thought there. Or you could just go flat if everything's sounding good up there. Then we also have a couple of other things here. They've obviously added some bass down here in the, let's see here, where did they do it? They centered it around 110 hertz. And they actually used a low shelf to do that. That's an interesting way to do it. They also applied a high pass filter. So after 80 hertz, it's rolling off any of the low end rumble that may be down here. So that's usually a good thing to do. I should qualify that. we'll talk more about that another time. But they are adding a little bit of bass to add some richness to the voice, presumably. And then also here, just a little cut here at around 300 hertz, just a small cut of -3 dB to kind of remove any sort of tubbiness, I guess is one way to describe it. Um, that can often be a problem area. I also find 1 kilohertz can often be a problem area if you're getting really harsh dialogue. So adding another item there. In fact, if we punch this one on to 1,000, that would be one where I might go -3 as well, depending on the vocal. The best thing to do, in my opinion, and again, we talked about this in the course, but I would actually crank it up by quite a bit, maybe 9 decibels. You probably need to narrow it down just a little bit. You don't wanna go too wide, but narrow the Q setting or the width setting here, and then sweep it back and forth very slowly while you're listening to the audio playback. And if you start to find particular frequencies, again, the frequency is represented along this axis right here. If you find certain frequencies where you're hearing a lot of strangeness, oftentimes the voice will almost start to whistle, um, or you'll get something that sounds very distorted. You know at that point that you probably have a frequency that's getting a little overemphasized. And so once you find that, then you can just drop that down, do a cut right there. And again, you can adjust the width to taste. And again, while you're listening to the audio, let your ears be your guide on that. So those are some thoughts. Another thought I would share with you is that if we actually reset this here and go back into the vocal enhancer, they're doing some pretty extreme things here, like adding 13.9 decibels. That's pretty extreme. Cutting 3 decibels is generally in the range where I like to do things if I can. If I'm having to do more than that, it's probably because I don't have a very good recording and I might want to look at my production recording process. I understand things happen during production that you can't necessarily go back and reshoot it all the time, but that's something to keep your eyes on. If you're finding yourself consistently doing massive, massive cuts and boosts in EQ to make it sound really good, that may be a sign that you might need to change something in your production process, your recordings themselves. This one's a little like on the extreme side too. I probably wouldn't go as high as 6. I would actually suggest to you that a 3 dB change in either direction, either a boost or a cut. So here we're doing a boost, here we're doing a cut. A 3 dB boost or cut is usually, for most people, is audible. If you do just a 1 decibel or 2 decibel, a lot of people aren't going to be able to hear that difference. But as soon as you hit 3, that's when most people can hear a difference. And I generally, if you don't have to, I wouldn't go a lot harder either direction than that, or higher or lower, greater than 3 dB on a boost or lower than -3 dB on a cut. Um, it might seem like a good idea at the time, and it might seem like it sounds good at the time, but what I would encourage you to do is maybe to make a change like that, that seems like it sounds good, and then step away for 15 minutes and come back and listen to it again and see if it still sounds good. Oftentimes you'll think, oh, well, that's too extreme once you come back to it. So just some kind of tips to keep in mind here as you're working with EQ. Now, one other thing to say on EQ, in Adobe Audition, this particular equalizer, there are different types of equalizers, and this one is not a linear phase equalizer. What that means in practical terms is if I do a change like this and apply it, watch what the waveform does. Let's just see what happens. Apply. Notice what happened to the waveform here. Suddenly, this peak has been pushed up here, and the corresponding peak on the other side of the waveform is only hitting -5 dB, whereas over here it's hitting -0.5. So it suddenly made the symmetry of the wave, it kind of pushed the symmetry of the waveform off. So another thing we talk about in our course is waveform symmetry and how to fix that. So just be aware that if you make changes, if you do some sort of EQ in Adobe Audition with the built-in EQ filter or effect, you are likely to get some asymmetry here, and you may need to do another pass with, if you go under Effects, Stereo Imaging, Graphic Phase Shifter, you may need to do another pass with this to kind of correct that asymmetry. So there are plugins out there that are available that are linear phase EQs that shouldn't mess with your EQ, or sorry, shouldn't mess with your waveform symmetry or phase when you apply the EQ. And those are really helpful because it just makes it a little bit faster to work with them, a little easier to work with them. Um, so that's something to keep in mind as well. Okay, let's do one last quick check-in here. Just see how things are looking in the Q&A board here. It gives me just a second to pull this up. Oh, I guess I lost it there. I must have closed the window. 1 second here and I'll get you over I'll get over there. I hope everyone has found these sessions helpful. I do appreciate the questions that come in, and again, I hope you're finding them to be helpful and actually helping you solve practical problems and making your sound better. That's really my hope here, and if you've got any feedback, I'd love to hear that as well. Okay. Screen is not moving. Apologies, people. Basic filmmaker, can I ask a question? Please do. I'm not sure how to follow this. I apologize for the trouble with the screen. And let me see how I get this question here. Again, this is our first week on YouTube doing it this way instead of Google Hangouts on Air, so it's a little bit different than we are used to, and it looks like I need to go to a new tab. To see the questions. Apologies for the delay here as we get things worked out. Okay, great. Basic Filmmaker asked for your new sound course on how to level and post-process sound. Great course, by the way. I level at minus 19 LK FS as I follow along, but when done, and you're looking at your levels in Audition, the dB levels are quite different. In other words, my result at minus 19 LK or LUFS shows visually around minus 6 dB. I've seen yours in the videos with the same setting sitting around minus 3 dB. Could you explain this difference or explain how there shouldn't be? Yes, good question. So let me try sharing here again really quickly and see if we can make this work. I think we may be having bandwidth problems, and I apologize for that. And that could be part of the reason we're not seeing the screen refresh. So here, for example, in this particular audio, I'm going to go to the amplitude statistics panel here and scan. And what this tells us is that we are currently sitting at minus 27 LUFS. Now, Kevin, I hope you don't mind me calling you Kevin in public. Kevin is the basic filmmaker. I think you're referring to are you referring to the peaks when you say minus 3 or minus 6 dB? Nope. Yes, okay. All right. Let's try sharing again. It probably just popped off, and I'm going to reshare here with Adobe Audition. Okay. All right. Loudness is a pretty sophisticated measure. It's taking into account more than just the peak amplitude. It's taking into account lots of other things. So it's very, very possible to have peaks, in this case, for example, that are hitting -2 dB full scale, which you see here, and yet the loudness is only at -27 LUFS. You'll recall once we've done the technique I show you for actually compressing and then loudness normalizing to -19 LUFS or -16 LUFS, depending on whether you're doing mono or stereo or whatever else you're trying to do, you will still have peaks around the same area, maybe a little bit hotter, maybe only 1.5 dB, but nevertheless, you'll see a tremendous increase in the overall loudness based on your loudness units full scale or LKFS reading on that audio. So this has to do with a measure of perceived loudness, how we hear loudness. And again, if you recall from the course, one of the things that really determine how loud something sounds to us is not just its amplitude, but how long it stays at that amplitude. So how long it stays at that amplitude over time. So that's, I hope that's making sense. So in essence, what we do is we kind of take these transients here, these very skinny peaks, and we compress those pretty aggressively, say down maybe here down to the -9 level. Then what's left to normalize and to amplify until it comes up until this, -1.5 range here is a much fatter waveform. And by fatter, I mean, if you look at these here, notice how it's fatter down here than it is up here. So that is actually going to make it at some level, at a perceived loudness level, it's going to sound a lot louder once you essentially take this peak, squash it down, take the entire waveform and pull it up. You couldn't see my pointer, apologies for that. So you take this peak here, you squash it down, then you take the rest of this waveform, which is fatter down here, and you pull it up. Now we have amplitude that's sitting at, say, -1.5, but it lasts a lot longer. And so overall, the audio is going to sound louder to us. And it will actually result in a louder LUFS reading. So I hope that kind of answers the question. That's the main idea. And you will definitely see some variances. You can have audio that sits at -16 LUFS, and the peaks only go up to maybe -3 dB. That's totally possible, completely possible. So it's important to, that's why I use Adobe Audition, why I'm a little bit more enthusiastic about using Adobe Audition, especially for my professional jobs where I have to hit a target loudness versus something like Audacity, which is completely free. And this is not a bash on Audacity. I love Audacity. I'm just amazed at what they can do for free software. But Audacity doesn't have the ability to measure loudness and to do any sort of true peak limiting. So that's a big limitation when you're trying to get standard loudness in your audio from project to project and to meet any sort of standards that you need to meet when you're going to broadcast. So hopefully I didn't talk around your question. Hopefully I actually answered it. Okay. There we go. Well, people, we went a little bit over time. I appreciate everyone's questions this week and for everyone attending. Keep those questions coming. If you've got anything that you don't feel necessarily comfortable asking here, you're certainly welcome to email me, curtis@learnlightandsound.com. Again, for those of you that were not aware, we have launched our post-processing course. Please go take a look. I have a little promo video that explains it in a little bit more detail. If it's not something that you want to do, totally understand, or you're not kind of ready for it, tell your friends about it. We'd love to have more people join up and learn more about making awesome sound. So thanks again, everyone, and we will talk to you again next week.